What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So I've got another fun sort of martial arts slash combat topic today, and that is basically like the degree to which normal people cannot fight, and worse yet, the degree to which most martial artists cannot fight. That's sort of the overall topic of the video, but I want to begin it with an anecdote, and it's the anecdote that the title and the thumbnail allude to, which is to do with a professor I knew when I was in college. Now, for context, this was during the time of COVID. Everything was happening on Zoom. A lot of stuff, like a lot of classes were like not happening because of the restrictions thereof. So people had more downtime. And the guy in question wasn't actually the professor running the class. He was a friend of that professor, and he was himself a professor at a different university. But what he was doing was he sort of audited this capstone course and was sort of technically there as a student, but he was like effectively serving as an assistant to the professor. And it was just an excuse for him to hang out with all of us and like chat the shit about philosophy. And that was all well and good. But over the course of the class, at multiple points did he bring up and insert into conversation that he did capoeira. And bear in mind, like, I don't even think I mentioned my own background. I didn't mention that I was a fighter. I didn't mention that I do jiu-jitsu. I've taught jiu-jitsu. I didn't mention any of that shit. But like at multiple points that he mentioned that he did capoeira. And as this went on, at some point, I just felt the need to pry and sort of dig a little into that. And I wanted to do it as politely as possible, as non-confrontationally as possible, because I didn't want to create any undue drama. But at some point, like during a break when we were all sitting around chatting, I just said to him, like, hey, I've heard you mention you do capoeira. I've done a bit of martial arts myself. But I've never done capoeira, which wasn't actually true because I had spent like a month in the past checking out some local capoeira school in Minneapolis. More on that later. But I just said to him like, oh, I've never done capoeira, but I'm like aware of it as a martial art. What is your view of it? And I said to him, do you see it as like a combat art, as a self-defense art? Do you see it more as sort of like a movement culture, traditional method sort of thing? Like, how do you view it? And so I kind of gave him a range of options, some of which were fucking stupid and some of which were quite reasonable. And I wanted to see what he would say. And I can't remember his exact words, but it was about as bad as it could have been. Like, he didn't go quite so far, probably just because he had the social tact, but he didn't go quite so far as to say like, yeah, it's the best martial art, and I can kick people's asses because I do it. Like, I'm Billy Badass because I do capoeira. But he all but said that. Like, he heavily implied that. He heavily implied that capoeira is a serious fighting system and that he can seriously fight because he does it. And he seemed quite high on himself as he said it. And I just let it go. I was just like, oh, okay. But like in my head, I was just like, Jesus Christ. Because and not merely because capoeira is not a practical fighting art, but in addition to that, like this guy was just like a wimp. Like he wasn't that old. He was, I doubt he was even in his 40s, but he was just like a wimpy, small, like string bean geek. Like he just looked frail and pathetic. And that's fine if you're just an academic. And his personality, aside from big-upping himself when talking about capoeira, like his personality was one of a wimpy, timid nerd. That was just he was like that the annoying guy in King of the Hill. The like social worker guy. Like that was him. And I was in my head. I'm just like, bro, like, I wouldn't even need to use martial arts to like fuck you up. I could purposely if I just decided to attack him, I could purposely choose to use no technique I've ever learned in any martial art, and he couldn't stop me. Like I could just grab him and like force his head underwater and drown him, and he couldn't stop me. I could just grab him and violently slam him about into the walls, and he couldn't stop me. Like I could just do whatever to this guy, and he couldn't stop me. And and he just had the personality like many people do, where it's like, man, I think if I walked up and just like slapped you in the face, like you would just freeze. Like it would like rock your world that happened, and you would have no response. Like that was just the vibe the guy had. And that's true of many people. That's true of a lot of other martial artists. Like I knew a similar guy when I was younger. I was a teenager, and he was a guy I worked with. he was a cool dude and everything, but he was also in college and he was also like an academic geek and a similarly built, like a tall, skinny, frail guy. And he did Taekwondo. And he knew I was prepping for MMA at the time, and he like took very seriously the fact that he did Taekwondo. And at some point I just asked him, I was like, dude, have you ever been punched in the face? Not because I was threatening him, but just because I was asking, throughout his lifetime and his training, has he ever been punched in the face? And he told me no. And I'm just like, because if you know, you know. If you've trained, you know. If you've just been in a goddamn fight, you know, okay? That if you've never been punched in the goddamn face, you don't know shit, you can't do shit, okay? But why I think this is so ridiculous is because, so why this stood out to me so much, why this memory, this story has stuck with me, is especially with the case of this professor, it's like, bro, you are a philosophy professor. Your field is critical thinking and logic, okay? And you don't live in an ignorant time. You live post UFC 1. You live in an era where the UFC might not be mainstream, but it's mainstream enough that you, especially as a martial artist, are fucking aware of it. And yet you still delude yourself with this nonsense. And I think it just comes from being like a wimpy, timid person, but like most men needing this fantasy that like, no, I'm not a huge pussy and I can actually take care of things. And like acting out that fantasy in a sort of LARPing-like way, because for better or for worse, we live in a society where you can often get through life without ever actually having that checked, without ever actually getting into a fight if you don't want to, without ever actually getting assaulted. You can often achieve that. So I think that's how this phenomenon like persists. But nevertheless, it just stood out to me as like just a profound, remarkable lack of self-awareness and like self-induced delusion. Again, from someone for whom critical thinking and objectivity and things like that should be foremost in their life, at the forefront of their life. And, to the topic of the video as a whole, like this just applies to like everyone. Okay, this applies to everyone who's not the following. Either. Well, not either. Either means, but either only should be used when there's two examples. I have more than two examples. But this applies to anyone who isn't a trained fighter, and by trained fighter, I mean who trains in a combat sport, trains in an art, at least, that includes resistance, that includes sparring with impact and or grappling with resistance, okay? If you're not, like, trained in those things, if you are not a just violent, like, criminal, like, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of people doing life in prison right now who are career criminals who've never once stepped in a boxing gym or on a wrestling mat, but they're just mean bastards and they're willing to do violence and they like hurting people and they've been in countless fights in their lifetimes, and yeah, that guy can scrap to some degree. If you're not that person, and if you're not, like, some trained athlete who does a sport with full contact and has done S&C training and built muscle and built strength and built explosiveness, if you're not like a collegiate football player or something like that, if you're none of those things, you just can't fucking fight, okay? And most people are not those things, and most martial artists, frankly, are not those things, okay? And this applies to me. Like, I came up doing bullshit martial arts. And by bullshit, I just mean they don't prepare you for really fighting. Like, I'm not against people doing other martial arts. I'm not against traditional martial arts. I'm not against internal martial arts and any of those kinds of things. Like, if you do Tai Chi, if you do traditional Kung Fu, Filipino martial arts, whatever, like, I'm all for that. Like, I don't think you have to be getting hit in the head and preparing to fight or anything. Like, I'm also not against people doing yoga or doing dance or doing anything else. But the difference is your yoga teacher isn't telling you that it's preparing you to fight. Okay, that's the difference. And again, like, I came up doing stuff like that, and I have a very specific memory, even more salient than the anecdote about the professor, where I had done Filipino martial arts as a younger teenager. I'd done a couple of years of Pakiti Tersha Kali, and I remember the first time when I was like 16, 17, I went to an actual MMA gym where they sparred with full contact, and I remember the first day of sparring. I remember like putting on the boxing gloves, putting on the shin guards, and being like, okay, I've never done this before, and I know it's different than what I have done in the past, but surely the stuff I've done will like help me. I'm not saying it'll make me like kick everyone's ass here or anything, but surely all of the trapping, all of the empty hand, all of the, kind of shit I did doing Kali, surely that will help me out here to some degree. That's what I was thinking going in. And none of that was true. None of that was remotely true. I remember like very distinctly like squaring up with a guy, and the first time like, bah, like getting punched in the face, and my reaction was just like, internally, I was just like, fuck! Oh! And like I was just like freezing up inside, and I was tense, and none of the techniques were coming back, none of the defenses. I wasn't like parrying and doing, I wasn't doing anything like that to block anything. And when I tried to hit him back, it didn't look good either. I was just stiffly going like, like that at them. And yeah, and I got my ass kicked. And they didn't like bludgeon me, they knocked me down and stuff, but like, it was just normal sparring, no bad etiquette on their part. But yeah, I got my ass kicked. And that's a real wake-up moment. And I give people those wake-up moments myself. Like, it's somewhat regular that I especially grapple, with a new person who's never done it, and they genuinely are like, their eyes are opened by the fact that they can't do anything to me, and that I can do whatever I want to them. And that's when I'm going light. That's when I'm just kind of, I let them in my guard, I let them try a few things, I tie them up a little, I sweep them, I get mount, I just kind of sit there for a little bit, they can't escape. I maybe walk them through something, and then I gently set up a choke or something, and, tell them like, okay, I'm putting this choke on, you can tap out. And like, even just that experience can just like blow people's minds, and they're like, fuck, I really can't do anything to these people. And again, that's a wake-up call, and you can either, it's like Rafiki says to Simba, man, you can either run from it or learn from it. And that's a choice people got to make in that situation. You can either pretend that, like, just put that shit out of your mind and treat it like a repressed memory and just act like it didn't happen and go back to deluding yourself, or you can embrace it and say, well, I guess I got to learn this shit. I guess there is this gulf between me and between cats who can actually fucking fight. And I want to become one of those guys. So I guess I'm going to stick around and put my goddamn time in. And that's what you got to do. And don't get me wrong. Like, most people cannot fight. Most men cannot fight. It's not the end of the world. You don't have to do MMA. You don't have to train. You don't have to go get punched in the face, etc., etc. It's not the end of the world if you don't do that. You're not like a lesser human being if you don't do that stuff. But I would just say, search your feelings. Those of you watching this, if you don't train, if you haven't done those things, search your feelings about just what your own thoughts are of your own fighting abilities, and whether or not it's a source of angst, whether or not deep down there's a part of you that's like, what would I do if I was out at a concert or something and some guy grabbed my girlfriend's ass? Like, what would I do? Do I actually think I could handle that situation? Like just, if that's a source of angst for you, then I would consider just actually learning how to fight. I'd also consider, because me, like, I've thankfully avoided, I've got a few anecdotes that'll probably come up later in the channel, down the road in the channel's history. I've got a few anecdotes of confrontations I've been in my lifetime, but like, thankfully I've avoided most serious ones, especially as an adult. I got in more fights when I was a kid, but like, as an adult, I've avoided most serious altercations. And the main way I do that is I just don't do the nightlife thing, I don't go out to the clubs and the concerts and stuff, and I don't go looking for trouble, I don't walk around with a chip on my shoulder, like, eyeballing dudes and looking to take offense and shit. It's largely avoidable. You never know, fate brings you what it brings you, but largely speaking, if you don't want trouble, you can avoid it. And so, again, if you can't fight, that's probably not the end of the world. But if you think you can fight, and you can't, or if it's a thing about which you have like serious angst, because even martial artists have that angst. Like martial artists who don't test their shit, and you hear this espoused by people who transition from traditional martial arts that train without resistance to more like combat sports style martial arts, you often hear them tell you like, yeah, I can now look back on my time when I was doing the traditional arts, and I realized that I deep down always had this question of like, could I actually do this if push came to shove? Because push never comes to shove in the goddamn training environment. Whereas now, you just know, like if you're doing wrestling, jiu-jitsu, judo, boxing, Muay Thai, kickboxing, MMA as a whole, whatever. Like if you're doing that stuff, you just know you can do it. And that's not to get into the whole open the can of worms that is combatives and is, how to apply that stuff in the streets and blah, blah, blah. But just, you do know you can do it. You know physically you can do it to another person who's resisting and who's trying to stop you. You just at least know that much. And you don't get that if you're just doing like strip mall kung fu or you're doing capoeira or whatever. And I said I'd touch on that later in the vid. Like when I did capoeira, like my takeaway was like, yeah, this is like kind of neat, but this is not useful. This is not going to make me a better fighter in any way that will make the juice worth the squeeze. Because I'm sure there's going to be people in the comment section being like, yeah, but Thiago Santos did capoeira and this guy did capoeira and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, yeah, being able to do cartwheels and do like really fast spinning kicks is always going to be useful, okay? But the lion's share of what capoeira is and what you work on is not useful at all. And by itself, it's not going to give you enough. Like by itself, like those guys also do Muay Thai and everything else, and they get their actual sense of distance and timing and whatnot from those things and not from doing capoeira. And anyone who's actually boxed and done kickboxing and et cetera just knows what a fucking uphill battle it is to build the sense of timing and comfortability and whatnot that you need to actually like manage the space of a fight. And you're just not getting that from the goofy like breakdance shit that you do with your partner in capoeira. You're just not getting that. So again, as an art, it is effectively useless. It's more useless than just lifting weights, okay? Like, if I had to fight some random person and I had two options. I had an option between one guy and all I knew about him was that he did capoeira forever, and another guy and all I knew about him was that he can bench press 300 pounds. I'm going to fight the fucking capoeira guy. Like of course I'm going to fight that guy. It's not even a question. And that's just lifting weights, which by itself isn't that big of a boost, So that's all I've got on that. Just a little story, just a little commentary about the nature of fighting and learning how to fight and who can and cannot fight, okay? And if you want to learn how to fight, if that's a thing you feel like you need in your life, don't delude yourself. Just go learn. Just go train. Just go to a goddamn combat sports gym. Shit, if you're young enough, just join your goddamn wrestling team and you'll be good. You'll be able to kick most people's asses. That's all you need. So that's all I got on that. Take it easy.